Welcome to Blissfully Boring. Let's get straight into it. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the British legal system faced a growing dilemma. The burgeoning population, combined with economic hardships and social upheaval from the Industrial Revolution, led to a significant increase in crime. Prisons were overflowing, and the traditional punishments of fines, public humiliation, or execution were proving insufficient to manage the sheer volume of offenders. A new solution was sought, one that would remove criminals from British society altogether. This led to the policy of transportation, a sentence that would exile convicts to the most remote corner of the known world, Australia. The journey to this sentence often began in a courtroom. The range of offenses that could result in transportation was remarkably broad. While serious crimes like murder, assault, or forgery were on the list, the majority of transportable offenses were for theft. Stealing a loaf of bread, a handkerchief, or a few shillings worth of goods could be enough to earn a one-way ticket to the other side of the globe. Poaching, rioting, and political dissent were also common grounds for transportation. The courts processed these cases with a certain procedural rhythm, and for many of the accused, the outcome was almost a foregone conclusion. Sentences were typically for 7 years, 14 years, or for life, a term that effectively meant permanent exile. Once sentenced, the convicts' lives changed irrevocably. They were moved from local jails to holding prisons or decommissioned naval vessels known as hulks. These hulks, moored in rivers and estuaries like the Thames and at ports such as Portsmouth and Plymouth, were essentially floating prisons. Conditions on board were notoriously poor. The ships were old, damp, and overcrowded. Inmates were confined below deck in cramped, unsanitary spaces, often chained together. The diet was meager, consisting mainly of biscuits, salted meat, and oatmeal. Disease was rampant, and the mortality rate on the hulks could be high. For months, sometimes even years, convicts would wait in these grim conditions for a ship to become available for the long voyage to New South Wales. This period of waiting was a harsh introduction to the loss of freedom that defined their new existence. The ships selected for the convict fleets were not purpose-built for transporting passengers. They were typically merchant vessels, whalers, or naval transport ships chartered by the British government. Their primary design was for carrying cargo, not people. The space between decks, known as the orlop deck, was converted into a makeshift prison. Wooden bunks, often in tiers, were installed, providing minimal space for each person. A standard bunk was meant to accommodate for convicts, but overcrowding often meant that 6 or more were squeezed in. The headroom was so low that in many areas a person could not stand upright. Ventilation was poor, relying on small grated hatches that were often kept closed in rough seas, leaving the air below deck foul and stagnant. Before the convicts boarded, the ship had to be provisioned for a journey that could last up to 8 months. The scale of this task was immense. Tons of food and water had to be loaded. The standard rations for each convict were calculated on a weekly basis and included salted beef or pork, dried peas, oatmeal, cheese, and hardtack biscuits. These were supplemented with occasional servings of butter, sugar, and vinegar, the latter believed to help prevent scurvy. Water was stored in large wooden casks, but it often became contaminated and foul-tasting during the long months at sea. In addition to food for the convicts and crew, the ships also carried tools, seeds, livestock, and building materials needed for the new colony. Every available inch of space was utilized for storage. The clothing provided to convicts was basic and uniform. Upon being processed for transportation, their personal clothes were confiscated, and they were issued a government-supplied convict uniform. For men, this typically consisted of a coarse woolen jacket and waistcoat, trousers made of canvas or duck cloth, a linen shirt, woolen stockings, and heavy leather shoes. Women were given a simple woolen gown, a petticoat, a cap, and a neckerchief. The quality was poor, and the clothing was ill-fitting, designed for durability rather than comfort. Each convict received 1 or 2 sets of this clothing, which had to last for the entire voyage and their initial period in the colony. These garments were often marked with broad arrows or other symbols to identify the wearer as a prisoner of the crown. The process of boarding the transport ships, known as embarkation, was a carefully orchestrated operation. Convicts were brought from the hulks in small boats, often still in chains. As they came aboard, their names were checked against a master list or indent. This document was a critical piece of administrative paperwork, recording each convict's name, age, trade, crime, sentence, and place of trial. It was, in essence, their official identity for the duration of their sentence. Once on deck, they were inspected by the ship's surgeon, who had the authority to refuse anyone deemed too ill to survive the voyage. This was not always an act of compassion. A high death rate on board could result in financial penalties for the ship's master. After the inspection, the convicts were led below deck to the prison quarters. The men were usually kept in irons, at least for the initial part of the journey. Leg irons, connecting two convicts together, were common. Women and children were generally not chained. The first impression of the space below would have been one of darkness, confinement, and the overwhelming noise of hundreds of people packed into a small area. The convicts would find their allotted bunk space and stow their meager possessions, which might include their bedding, a metal bowl, and a spoon. For many, this was the moment the reality of their exile truly began to set in. The familiar shores of Britain were about to disappear from view, replaced by the vast unknown expanse of the ocean. Responsibility for the convicts during the voyage fell to the ship's master, the surgeon, and a contingent of marine guards. The master was in overall command of the vessel and its crew. The surgeon was not only responsible for the health of everyone on board, but also for the general welfare and management of the convicts. They kept detailed journals, recording illnesses, punishments, and daily routines. The military guard, commanded by a junior officer, was there to maintain order and prevent any attempts at mutiny. This created a clear hierarchy on board, with the convicts at the very bottom, subject to the authority of the ship's command structure. The final days in port were a period of intense activity. Last-minute supplies were loaded, the crew made their final preparations, and official inspections were completed. For the convicts below deck, these days were a blur of noise and motion, with little understanding of the proceedings above. They could hear the shouts of the sailors, the creaking of the ship's timbers, and the movement of cargo. Finally, the order would be given to weigh anchor. With the sails unfurled and catching the wind, the transport ship would slowly pull away from the dock, leaving the port and the shores of Britain behind. The great, uncertain journey had begun. This departure was not just a physical one. It was a separation from everything they had ever known, family, home, and country. Ahead lay an 8-month voyage and a new, harsh life in a land few in Britain could even imagine. The ship, a wooden world unto itself, was now their entire existence, carrying its human cargo toward the foundation of a new nation. Now let us look at the long voyage south together. When the order to sail was finally given, the clanking of anchor chains marked the true beginning of their exile. As the ships navigated the English Channel and the coastline of Britain faded from view, it was the last time many would ever see their homeland. For them, the world they knew was gone, replaced by the vast, seemingly endless expanse of the ocean. The journey south was a trial of endurance that could last anywhere from 4 to 8 months, depending on the route and the weather. The air grew thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, stale bilge water, and sickness. A typical day was governed by a strict routine. Convicts were usually allowed on deck in small, supervised groups for a few hours each day, weather permitting. This was their only chance for fresh air and a glimpse of the sky. The horizon, an unbroken line of gray or blue, was their constant companion. The rest of their time was spent below, in the dim light filtering through the grates. Boredom was a constant affliction, punctuated by the rhythmic creaking of the ship's timbers and the sound of waves against the hull. Water was strictly rationed and often became foul over the long months at sea. Scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a constant threat. Ship surgeons did what they could, but their knowledge and supplies were limited. Early voyages saw high mortality rates from scurvy, dysentery, and typhoid. The journey followed established sea lanes. After leaving Britain, the ships would sail south, often stopping at ports like Rio de Janeiro or Cape Town to take on fresh water and supplies. For the convicts, these stops were a brief but significant break in the monotony. It was a fleeting connection to the world outside their floating prison before they were once again consigned to the open sea. From the Cape of Good Hope, the ships would enter the Southern Ocean. Here, they encountered the roaring 40s, powerful westerly winds that propelled them eastward toward Australia. This leg of the journey was often the most perilous. The weather was unpredictable and violent. Massive waves would crash over the decks, and the ships would roll and pitch relentlessly. Storms could last for days, trapping everyone below deck in terrifying darkness. The hatches would be battened down, sealing the convicts in a suffocating, chaotic environment as the ship fought against the elements. Discipline on board was maintained by the ship's captain and a contingent of soldiers. The convicts were subjects of the crown, but on the high seas, the captain's word was law. Infractions of the rules, from theft of rations to fighting, were punished swiftly. The threat of the lash was a constant reminder of their status and the power held over them. Yet, amidst the hardship, small communities formed. Prisoners shared stories, gambled with whatever they had, and forged bonds of friendship and necessity. As the months passed, the signs of land would begin to appear. The color of the water would change. Seabirds, different from those seen in the Atlantic, would begin to circle the ships. The air itself seemed to smell different. For those who had survived the journey, the first sighting of the Australian coastline was a moment of profound significance. It was not a promised land, but the end of a seemingly endless voyage and the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter of their lives. Finally, the ships would navigate their way into a harbor like Port Jackson in Sydney. The anchor would drop, its chain rattling in a sound that mirrored their departure months earlier. Upon dropping anchor in Sydney Cove or the Derwent River, the long sea voyage was officially over. For the convict, this was not an arrival into a bustling, established city, but rather a disembarkation into what must have seemed like the edge of the known world. The sights, sounds, and even the quality of the light were entirely alien. The familiar, soot-stained stone and crowded lanes of British cities were replaced by a vast, unfamiliar landscape under a wide, often harsh, sky. The initial process upon arrival was one of administration and assessment. Before they even set foot on solid ground, officials, often the colonial surgeon, would come aboard. His task was to inspect the general health of the transportees. Records were checked and the ship's log was reviewed. This was a slow, methodical process, a final accounting of the human cargo that had survived the months at sea. Those who were ill were marked for transfer to the rudimentary colonial hospital, a place often strained for resources. Once cleared, the convicts were brought ashore, not in a single mass, but in smaller, more manageable groups. They would have been a spectacle for the small existing population of soldiers, officials, and earlier arrivals. For the convicts themselves, their first steps on land after so long at sea would have been unsteady. Their legs, accustomed to the roll of the ship, would have found the solid ground strange and difficult to navigate. This physical disorientation was a fitting metaphor for the social and emotional dislocation they were about to experience. The air itself would have been different. Instead of the damp, salty, and often foul air of the ship, their senses would be met with the scent of eucalyptus, dry earth, and the smoke from wood fires. The sounds were equally strange. The calls of unfamiliar birds, the chirping of insects, and the rustle of wind through unknown types of trees. Everything served as a constant reminder that they were immeasurably far from home. The next stage was a formal muster on shore. Lined up under the watchful eyes of soldiers, their names were called from a list. This was a moment of transition, where they ceased to be just numbers on a ship's manifest and were officially entered into the records of the colony. Their physical appearance, skills, and previous occupations were noted. This information was vital for the colonial administration, as it determined where each convict would be most useful. A blacksmith, a carpenter, or a stonemason was a valuable asset in a developing colony desperate for infrastructure. These skilled individuals might be assigned directly to government work projects, such as constructing buildings, quarrying stone, or building roads. A literate man or woman might find themselves assigned as a clerk, a relatively privileged position. Those without specific trades, the vast majority, were designated as general laborers. Their future was one of hard, manual work. Their convict clothing, often worn and tattered from the voyage, was sometimes replaced with a new set of government-issued slops. This typically consisted of a simple shirt, trousers, or a skirt, and a hat, all made from coarse, durable fabric. This uniform, often marked with broad arrows, served a dual purpose. It was practical for labor, but it also visibly marked them as convicts, stripping away individual identity and reinforcing their status within the rigid colonial hierarchy. The initial accommodation was basic. Large, barn-like structures, known as barracks, were constructed to house them. Inside, conditions were crowded. Rows of simple wooden bunks or hammocks offered little in the way of privacy or comfort. These barracks were not homes. They were functional dormitories designed for control and efficiency. The day was structured and regulated. beginning and ending with the sound of a bell. The food, known as rations, was a significant change. While the shipboard diet was monotonous, the colonial ration was based on what could be produced or procured locally, supplemented by stores from England. The quality and quantity could vary depending on the arrival of supply ships and the success of local harvests. Preparing this food was often a communal activity, cooked over open fires. For those not assigned to government public works, there was the system of assignment. Convicts could be assigned to work for free settlers, military officers, or government officials as laborers or domestic servants. This was essentially a lottery. A kind and fair master could offer a life of relative stability and the chance to learn new skills. However, the system was open to abuse, and many found themselves in situations where they were overworked and poorly treated with little recourse. The first days and weeks were a period of intense adjustment. The convicts had to learn a new set of rules, a new routine, and a new way of life, all under the constant supervision of overseers and soldiers. The work was physically demanding, especially for those who came from urban environments and were unaccustomed to manual labor. Clearing land, felling timber, and tilling the hard, unfamiliar soil required immense physical exertion under a sun that was far more intense than they had ever experienced. The landscape itself was a formidable presence. The dense, sprawling bush was a source of both wonder and fear. It was a stark contrast to the manicured fields and orderly woodlands of Britain. It represented a vast, untamed wilderness that was both a barrier and a constant, silent observer of their new lives. It was a world away from the crowded, familiar streets of London, Dublin, or Glasgow. Socially, the convicts had to navigate a new and complex pecking order. On the transport ships, a rough society had formed. In the colony, this was reshaped. Old hands, those who had been in the colony for years, held a certain status. New arrivals were at the bottom, needing to learn quickly how to survive. Friendships and alliances were formed out of necessity, providing a crucial support network in a place where they were otherwise isolated. Despite the hardship and the loss of freedom, the arrival was not purely an ending. It was also a beginning. The colony was a place of construction, of creation. Every brick laid, every field plowed, was a step in building a new society from scratch. The convicts, whether they willed it or not, were the primary engine of this development. Their labor was the foundation upon which the future colony would be built. In those initial moments, standing on the shore of this strange new land, the convict was confronted with a stark reality. Their old life was gone, severed by distance and law. Ahead lay an existence defined by labor, regulation, and servitude. The path to freedom, through a ticket of leave, or the expiration of their sentence, was a distant prospect. For now, their world had shrunk to the boundaries of the penal settlement, a new and challenging reality under the southern sun. What was their hope of survival? Their lives were now governed by a strict system of rules and regulations, where punishment was a constant and visible presence. The legal framework was designed to maintain order in a society built from exiles, and it relied heavily on physical discipline. For many, the reality of this new life began with an immediate understanding of the hierarchy in place. Upon arrival, convicts were assigned to various forms of labor. Rules were strict, and for some, punishment weighed heavily on their minds. The most common form of punishment for infractions was the lash. A convict found guilty of disobedience, theft, or attempting to escape would be sentenced to a specific number of strokes with the cat-o'-nine-tails, a multi-tailed whip designed to inflict maximum pain. These punishments were public spectacles carried out to deter others from similar behavior. The triangle, a wooden frame to which the person was tied, was a dreaded symbol of this brutal justice. Beyond the lash, other forms of punishment existed to control the convict population. Solitary confinement in dark, cramped cells was used to break a person's spirit. For more serious or repeat offenses, convicts could be sentenced to work in a chain gang. Shackled together with heavy leg irons, these groups performed the most arduous labor, such as building roads through rugged and remote terrain. The constant clanking of chains was a grim soundtrack to their daily existence. Despite the harshness of the system, avenues for hope and a path to freedom did exist. The ticket of leave was a significant milestone for a well-behaved convict. This document granted them the freedom to work for themselves and live independently within a specific district, though they were still technically convicts and had to report regularly to authorities. It was a taste of liberty, a powerful incentive to follow the rules and serve their time quietly. Earning a ticket of leave required a period of good conduct, and the length of time depended on the original sentence. A convict with a 7-year sentence might be eligible after 4 years, while someone sentenced to life might have to wait 12 years or more. Any transgression could result in the ticket being revoked, sending them back into the government's direct service. A further step towards freedom was the conditional pardon. This granted a convict freedom within the colony, but they were not permitted to return to Britain. It was a significant reward, often given for meritorious service, such as assisting authorities or demonstrating exceptional skill and industry over many years. For many, a conditional pardon was the true beginning of a new life as a settler in Australia, a chance to build a future in the land where they had been exiled. The most coveted prize was the absolute pardon, which restored all the rights of a free citizen, including the right to return home to Britain. These were granted far less frequently and were usually reserved for those who had made an outstanding contribution to the colony or had served a very long portion of a life sentence with an impeccable record. However, even with an absolute pardon, many chose to remain in Australia. The cost of the voyage home was prohibitive, and after so many years away, the lives they had left behind were often gone forever. For female convicts, the path to a better life often looked different. While they were also subject to the same system of work and punishment, marriage was a significant factor in their prospects. A woman who married a free settler, or even a male convict who had earned his ticket of leave, could gain a degree of domestic stability and social respectability. Her status would become tied to that of her husband. Children born in the colony were free citizens, regardless of their parents' convict status, and this created a powerful sense of purpose and a stake in the future of the new society. These children, the first generation of native-born Australians of European descent, grew up in a world their parents could never have imagined. They were not bound by the stigma of transportation and had opportunities that had been denied to the previous generation. They became farmers, merchants, and tradespeople, forming the backbone of the burgeoning colonial economy. Survival in this environment was not just about enduring punishment or working towards a pardon. It was also about navigating the complex social landscape of the penal colony. A small economy existed within the convict system itself. Tobacco, extra food rations, or handmade items could be bartered or sold. Small acts of kindness, shared information, or alliances formed in the barracks could make the difference between a manageable existence and one of constant misery. Convicts developed their own slang and codes, a private language that bonded them and kept secrets from the overseers. This flash language, originating from the criminal underworld of Britain, was a tool of solidarity and a way to maintain a sense of identity separate from their convict number. Over time, as more convicts served their sentences and became emancipists, the nature of the colony began to change. These former convicts, having earned their freedom, started businesses, acquired land, and raised families. They were a driving force in the development of towns and agriculture. Their knowledge of the local environment and their resilience made them integral to the colony's survival and growth. The architecture of the period still bears witness to their labor. The hand-carved sandstone blocks of official buildings, the construction of bridges, and the layout of early streets were all the work of convict hands. These structures are a lasting legacy, a physical reminder of the foundation upon which modern Australia was built. The system of transportation and punishment was harsh, but within it were threads of hope and the remarkable human capacity for endurance and adaptation. The story of the early convicts is not just one of suffering, but also of survival and the eventual creation of a new society. What was life like over the coming decades? For the tens of thousands who served their time, a new and uncertain chapter began in a land that was still largely unfamiliar. The journey from convict to colonist was complex, filled with both opportunity and immense hardship. Upon receiving a certificate of freedom, a former convict was legally a free person. They could, in theory, leave the colony and return to Britain. However, the cost of passage was prohibitive for most. The majority remained in Australia, not always by choice, but by necessity. Their immediate challenge was survival. Without the structure of the penal system, which provided rations and shelter, they had to find work and a place to live in a fledgling economy. These newly freed individuals were known as emancipists. Their social standing was ambiguous. While no longer prisoners, the stigma of their conviction clung to them. Free settlers, who had arrived in Australia of their own volition, often looked down on emancipists, viewing them as morally corrupt and inherently untrustworthy. This social division was a defining feature of early colonial society, creating a clear hierarchy. Emancipists were often barred from certain social circles, and their past was a constant shadow. Despite these prejudices, many emancipists found ways to build new lives. The colony was desperately in need of labor. They could find employment with free settlers, or even the government on public works projects. Those without a specific skill often worked as general laborers on farms, in towns, or at the docks. Wages were low, but for the first time in years, they were earning their own money. Women emancipists faced a different set of challenges. Their employment options were far more limited, typically confined to domestic service. They worked as maids, cooks, and laundresses in the households of wealthier settlers. The gender imbalance in the colony, with far more men than women, also placed them in a vulnerable position. Marriage was often seen as the most viable path to security, but it was not always a guarantee of a better life. Land was the ultimate symbol of success and independence. The colonial government, keen to encourage agriculture and expand the settlement, offered land grants. emancipists were eligible for these grants, though they were usually smaller than those given to free settlers. A typical grant for an emancipist might be around 30 acres. This was a remarkable opportunity for people who, in Britain, would likely have never owned property. Cultivating this land was an arduous task. It was often uncleared bushland, requiring immense physical labor to prepare for farming. They had to build their own homes, often starting with simple huts made of timber and bark. They battled unfamiliar pests, unpredictable weather, and the sheer isolation of rural life. Success depended on resilience, a bit of luck, and sometimes the support of neighbors who might also be former convicts. Those who succeeded became small-scale farmers, growing wheat, corn, or raising livestock. They were finally self-sufficient, masters of their own small domain. Beyond farming, some emancipists found success in business. They opened shops, inns, and breweries in growing towns like Sydney and Parramatta. They became merchants, traders, and even shipbuilders. A few achieved extraordinary wealth and influence. Samuel Terry, for example, arrived as a convict and became one of the wealthiest men in the colony, known as the Botany Bay Rothschild. Mary Rebbe, another former convict, took over her husband's shipping and trading enterprises after his death and became a respected and powerful figure in Sydney's business community. These success stories were, however, the exception rather than the rule. They were powerful symbols of what was possible, but the reality for most was a life of modest means and hard work. The past was never completely erased. Emancipists who acquired wealth still faced social snobbery. They might own more land or have more money than their free settler neighbors, but they could still be excluded from elite social clubs or viewed with suspicion. The children of emancipists, the first generation of native-born Australians of convict heritage, grew up in a different world. They were freeborn without the legal or social stain of a conviction. They inherited their parents' land, businesses, and often their resilience. This new generation helped to blur the lines between the emancipist and free settler communities. As the colony grew and matured, the origins of one's family became less important than their contribution to the new society being forged. Over the decades, the distinct identity of the emancipist class slowly faded. The end of transportation in the mid-19th century meant that the influx of new convicts ceased. The population became increasingly dominated by free immigrants and the native-born. The old social divisions, while they never vanished entirely, became less rigid. Former convicts and their descendants were gradually absorbed into the broader fabric of Australian society. Looking back, the post-sentence lives of convicts reveal a story of adaptation and perseverance. They were not just prisoners, they were the laborers, farmers, and entrepreneurs who helped build the foundations of a new nation. They navigated a world that was often hostile, carrying the weight of their past while trying to secure a future for themselves and their children. Their journey from a convict ship to a plot of land or a small business is a quiet but fundamental part of Australia's history, a testament to the human capacity to start again, even in the most unforgiving of circumstances. The landscape they helped to shape still bears the subtle imprints of their labor, and their legacy is woven into the complex identity of the country that was once their prison. Thank you for watching.